I've talked about encouraging your children to live at the boundaries of their abilities many times in past videos. In this one, I'm going to talk about the importance of maintaining certain types of boundaries. Boundaries that should not be crossed. You see, as important as it is to do everything you can to get your children to learn to push their boundaries when it comes to the physical, the mental, the emotional boundaries that can limit their growth, limit their ability to find real accomplishment, success and happiness. There are other boundaries that are just as critical for you to build to make sure your kids recognize as boundaries that, if crossed, lead to bad outcomes. Now, let me start with an example of one of those boundaries. A very simple one, but one, it's a very important one when it comes to your child's safety. And that is playing in the street or when to cross the street. You might think it's a silly example, but listen to this, straight from a Google search. Somewhere around 600 kids a year are killed in pedestrian-related accidents. Terrible stat, but it's even kind of worse. Over 67,000 are hurt each year in those pedestrian missteps, I'll call them. When my son was just 3 or 4 years old, we were playing in the street, kicking a soccer ball back and forth. One of his favorite ball, one of his favorite things he loved to do with me at that time. I see a car coming, so we both start to move to the sidewalk. Now he kicks his ball in the direction of the sidewalk, but it hits the curb and bounces back into the street. I turn, I look at him, and I can see he hesitates for a second, but then runs back into the street to get his ball. Any parent knows that what I felt, they all know what I felt at that moment. I run out waving my arms trying to make sure the car sees us. Much easier to see me than to see him. Now the car stops, we get the ball, return to the sidewalk. I light into him. My objective was to leave a mark on his brain so he would never do that again. There's no gentle parenting practitioner in the world that could convince me that speaking to him in a calm voice and explaining to a 3 or 4-year-old why he did what he did was wrong and dangerous, that doesn't make sense. There may be times to bring out the gentle parenting tool, but this was not one of them. I made him cry. I scared the crap out of him, actually. I let him run inside and calm down a bit before I followed. And once I was inside, I started again to tell him why what he had done was so wrong. I watched his face to see if I was getting through. I ended with pure gentleness, making sure he knew I loved him. I wanted to keep him safe. Gentle was a fine bookend to that situation, but I knew I had left a mark. Now, jump forward to when he was 13 or 14. We're walking to the downtown park in Atlanta. We had to cross a very busy street, and there were crosswalks for pedestrians. Pedestrians have the right of way. Cars, under state law, have to stop to allow pedestrians to cross the street. Me, with all my grown-up male bravado ignorance, I step out into the crosswalk because I knew I had the right of way, and the SUV flying down the road was supposed to stop for us. Basically, I was a complete dumbass, setting a terrible example and being a hypocrite to boot. Not good parenting. My son, on the other hand, just 13 or 14, he yells at me, "What are you doing? What if that car didn't stop?" And of course, he was right. It took me a little while to properly reflect on what I had done and what he had done. I thought back to the time that I had lit into him for trying to save his favorite soccer ball by running in front of a car. Eventually, I apologized to him and to my wife, who was silently fuming at me. I had helped him learn about a boundary when he was very young. Obviously, I'd gotten through and taught him a valuable lesson. Now, here's a different type of boundary, a behavior boundary. I talked about this in an earlier video, but it bears repeating. My rule for my very young son, when we were out and about on a play date, visiting a zoo, some activity, meant for his enjoyment. It was the 3 strikes and you're out. If I had to call him out for misbehaving, not following the rules 3 times, we were done. This is easy to say, but difficult to do in real life. It's lousy to set up a play date with someone and then have to apologize and leave. But it's incredibly important. But I was so strict with this policy and didn't need to enforce it too many times because I was consistent. The benefits from this policy are awesome. First, he quickly realized that bad behavior gets you nothing but misery. Second, staying within bounds, good behavior, gets him rewards. And lastly, where the boundaries are gave him a sense of security. Teaching your child boundaries in all sorts of things is worth its weight in gold. We rarely ever had problems in middle school or high school with our son. I can't recall a single teacher that had something bad to say about him. It was actually the opposite. When my wife and I spoke to his teachers on parents' nights at school over those years, inevitably, the first comment out of their mouth was always the same. Joseph is a very well-behaved student in and out of the classroom. We basically never had a problem with him in school. Sure, there were little things occasionally. I mean, he was a teenage boy, and most teenage boys are barely functioning human beings in many ways. I often referred to him as an orangutan, once in front of his teachers. But generally, we never had any disciplinary problems with him. I believe that was a direct result of being so consistent in his very early years regarding his behavior, what was appropriate in that time and that place. What many parents don't understand is that setting boundaries for a child, it gives the child a sense of security and comfort, basically a sense of well-being. If you've ever watched a World War II movie where the soldiers wander into a minefield, it's kind of the same thing. Where can I step? Which direction is safe? It's a sense of paralysis for that unfortunate soldier. It's the same thing with your kids. Clear and consistent boundaries help children feel safe and secure. Like, where can I play? Not in the street with cars coming. What behavior is wrong or right? They know the difference between what's right and wrong. You give them an inch, that's fine, but don't give them a mile. Now, this concept has been studied to the nth degree. You can find all kinds of studies online to verify how positive this approach is when raising your kids. Most parents understand this. The problem most parents have is consistency. If you, as the parent, fluctuate in the enforcement of the boundaries, that is, have the boundary over here sometimes and other times over there, that's very bad. It's very confusing for your young child. And young, that's really the biggest factor here. It's the biggest factor for you to remember. You've got to start young, very young. When your son or daughter starts taking their first steps, whoa baby, any parent knows that's been through that. They understand how life-altering that is. That's when a complete reevaluation of your home becomes necessary. That's really the start of teaching your child boundaries. There are way too many real dangers a newly walking child faces in virtually every home. You can't reason with a 12-month-old child. You can't explain to a 1-year-old while certain areas are out of bounds, like near the fireplace or the steps down to the basement, etc., etc. Like it or not, you've got to be authoritative. You have to be loud and clear and scary at times to prevent your 1-year-old from hurting themselves. Sorry, but gentle parenting doesn't get the job done. It doesn't. Sometimes, unfortunately, it's the fear of the consequences that keeps them safe. That's how it works for a 1-year-old. And guess what? That's how it works with your 16-year-old as well. Fear of the consequences. Why don't more of us race down the highway at 100 miles an hour? Fear of the consequences. We don't want to risk getting in a very expensive speeding ticket. Why don't more people cheat on their taxes? Fear of the consequences. No one wants the IRS to come calling. Adults have to deal with all kinds of boundaries. Some are self-imposed because even though you could cross that line and maybe get away with it, it's just not worth the risk. For example, be unfaithful to your spouse, you get caught crossing that line, your whole life will be turned on its head. Some boundaries are made clear by the law. Cross those lines and very bad outcomes could result. Drunk driving, best case scenario, you get caught, lose your license. The worst case, you could kill someone. Creating boundaries for your kids and teaching them that crossing certain boundaries leads to bad outcomes is an absolute must for every parent to do with their kids. As adults, we have to deal with all kinds of boundaries. Not creating boundaries for your young son or daughter, it's actually doing them a huge disservice. Why wouldn't you prepare your kids for something they will absolutely have to deal with as an adult? It's not likely you could be gentle with your kids when you're creating boundaries in their life. If you can, great. But what's important, what you have to focus on, is creating those boundaries. Your job as a parent is really twofold. First, clearly communicate the boundary to your little one. You've got to make sure they understand the boundary, where it is, not necessarily why, especially when they're young. They may not understand it, but absolutely make sure that they understand the where. The second part, it's the difficult part, consistently correcting them when they cross that line. Punishment, discipline, it doesn't matter what you call it. There has to be some kind of negative consequence for breaking those types of boundaries. Your job, your number one job as a parent, is to prepare your child for adulthood. There have been numerous articles written this past year of why many companies are hesitant to hire Gen Z grads. Some of the reasons: lack of motivation, poor organizational skills, challenges with feedback, they can't take criticism, poor problem solving skills, difficulty working with a team. The entirety of my ICD parenting approach is to develop those skills in your son or daughter. Self-motivation, organizational skills, how to take constructive criticism, teamwork and problem solving, those skills and many more. Today's parenting styles are failing. The kids raised with these new age approaches to parenting are not just falling behind, they're not even in the game. Raising an independent, confident, good decision maker is possible. There are all kinds of people, many people from each of the last few generations that are ICD adults, living their best lives. Some because of their parents and how they were raised. Some of them achieved ICD status in spite of their upbringing. That group impresses me the most. They're really the real winners. Life gave them lemons and they figured out on their own how to make lemonade. You don't have to chance it with your kids. You don't have to hope for the best. Purposefully, consciously, intentionally help your kids build the foundation to living an ICD life. Helping them learn the importance of respecting boundaries is another lesson they need to learn, and learn young. It will make them stronger. It will make them feel more confident and secure when they understand what is acceptable and what is not. Thanks for listening.